Consider this your formal notice, Mr. Davis. Your little illegal hotel business is officially over. The voice, a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, belonged to Karen Miller, the self-appointed queen of the Oakmont Meadows Homeowners Association. She stood on my pristine driveway, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, her plus-size frame clad in a lurid pink tracksuit that seemed to be losing a valiant but doomed battle against gravity. Beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable, was a young man in a crisp city code enforcement uniform clutching a clipboard like a shield. Karen gestured toward him with a flourish, as if presenting a winning lottery ticket. "Officer Thompson here has a lovely little present for you. A cease and desist order from the city, along with an initial fine of $5,000. It goes up every day you continue to defy the law." She practically vibrated with vindictive glee, her eyes scanning my property. The manicured lawn, the freshly painted trim on my house, the charming detached guest cottage at the back of the lot, as if she were mentally foreclosing on it all. The late afternoon sun cast a long shadow behind her, making her seem for a moment like some monstrous caricature of suburban authority. I looked from her gloating face to the nervous officer, then down at the official-looking papers he was holding out. The words violation and illegal short-term rental were stamped in aggressive red ink. My stomach didn't drop. My heart didn't race. Instead, a profound and icy calm washed over me, the kind of quiet focus I hadn't felt since my last tour overseas, when chaos was the norm and survival depended on seeing the entire board, not just the piece someone was trying to shove in your face. I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. This entire drama, this public shaming she had so carefully orchestrated, was about to blow up in her face in the most spectacular way imaginable. My hand didn't even tremble as I reached for the clipboard. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA president or a bureaucrat who thinks the rules don't apply to them, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one plays out. I took the clipboard from Officer Thompson, whose eyes darted between me and Karen, silently pleading for the earth to swallow him whole. I didn't read the violation notice itself. I didn't need to. I flipped past it to the attached pages, the section citing the specific municipal codes I had supposedly violated. My finger traced the lines of text, the dense, legalistic language that was designed to intimidate the average citizen. But I wasn't the average citizen. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Karen's smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of impatient annoyance. "Something funny, Mr. Davis? Don't bother reading the fine print. It's ironclad. I made sure of it." I finally looked up, first at the young officer. "Thompson, is it? How long have you been with code enforcement?" He swallowed, a little thrown off. 6 months, sir." I nodded slowly. 6 months. Okay. Then my gaze shifted, locking onto Karen. "You made sure it was ironclad? That's interesting, because I made sure of it too." I tapped a specific paragraph on the page. "You see this? City Ordinance 11-3B, subsection 4, paragraph A. The one governing accessory dwelling units used for short-term lodging?" Her eyes narrowed, confused. "What about it?" I allowed myself a small, cold smile. "I wrote it." The silence that followed was a beautiful, perfect thing. Officer Thompson's jaw literally dropped, his professional composure shattering into a million pieces. Karen's face went through a rapid, fascinating series of transformations, from smug certainty to confusion, then to dawning disbelief, and finally to a deep, mottled shade of crimson rage. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She looked like a beached carp, gasping for the receding tide of her own authority. You what?" she finally sputtered, the words catching in her throat. I turned my full attention back to the officer, my voice calm and instructional. Officer Thompson, if you'll look at the ordinance you're attempting to enforce, you'll note that it was drafted and recommended for passage by the mayor's Blue Ribbon Panel on Urban Planning and Economic Development. I chaired that panel for 2 years after I retired from the Army. My signature is on the final draft submission, a copy of which is on file in the city clerk's office. The very ordinance you're citing was my capstone project before I fully retired. I know every single word, every comma, every loophole because I designed them. I pointed to my guest cottage. That is a legally permitted accessory dwelling unit, or ADU. The permit is on file with the city planning department. Under subsection 4, paragraph A, an owner-occupied primary residence is permitted to operate an associated ADU as a short-term rental, provided it meets certain safety and registration requirements. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, extracting a laminated card. This is my STR registration permit from the city, renewed last month. And if you check the fire marshal's records, you'll find the ADU passed its annual safety inspection 3 weeks ago with a perfect score. I handed the card to the officer, who took it with a trembling hand. He stared at it, then at the ordinance, then at me, his face a mask of dawning horror and professional embarrassment. He knew he'd been played, not by me, but by the furious woman standing next to him. "Karen, Bimas," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing its instructional tone and taking on a hard, metallic edge. "You didn't do your homework. You saw a new neighbor making a little extra income, and your first, last, and only instinct was to try and crush it. You weaponized a city department without understanding the laws you were trying to use. You brought this young officer out here on a wild goose chase to publicly humiliate me." I took a step closer, and for the first time she instinctively took a step back. The predator had become the prey. "This isn't over," I said softly. "You've just declared a war you have absolutely no idea how to fight. You wanted my attention, Karen? Well, now you have it." My life before moving to Oakmont Meadows had been defined by structure and purpose. For 24 years, I was Colonel Mark Davis of the United States Army JAG Corps. I wasn't a frontline soldier. My battles were fought in courtrooms, hearing rooms, and over stacks of documents that could decide the fate of soldiers and the integrity of the institution I served. I learned that victory wasn't always about overwhelming force. More often, it was about superior preparation, unwavering discipline, and the patient, methodical dismantling of an opponent's position until it collapsed under its own weight. When I retired, the silence was deafening. The rigid structure of military life was gone, replaced by an unnerving amount of empty time. My wife, Sarah, had passed away a few years prior, and my daughter, Emily, was just starting to look at colleges. I needed a new mission. I found it for a time in civic service. The mayor of our growing city, a former commander of mine, asked me to lead a panel tasked with a thorny issue: short-term rentals. The city was booming, and platforms like Airbnb were exploding. Homeowners wanted the right to earn income from their property, but residents were terrified of their neighborhoods turning into transient hotel zones. It was a minefield of competing interests, legal ambiguities, and passionate arguments. For 2 years, my team and I worked. We studied ordinances from 100 other cities. We held town halls, listening to furious homeowners and anxious investors alike. We consulted with real estate lawyers, zoning experts, and fire marshals. My JAG background was perfect for it. I was trained to find the precise defensible line between competing rights. The result was City Ordinance 11-3B. It was a piece of work I was immensely proud of. It wasn't a ban, it was a framework. It protected homeowners' rights but put strict limits in place. It required owner occupancy for properties with STRs, ensuring a resident was always on site and accountable. It mandated safety inspections, registration, and limited the number of non-resident STR investment properties in the city. Most importantly for my later battle, it explicitly protected the right to rent out a permitted accessory dwelling unit, seeing it as a way to increase housing density and allow homeowners to afford their mortgages. It was balanced, it was fair, and it was legally bulletproof. I had made sure of it. Once the ordinance was passed and my work was done, I sought a quieter life. I bought the house in Oakmont Meadows, a beautiful property with a large yard and, crucially, a small, well-built guest house. It was perfect. I could live in the main house, and the income from renting the guest house would create a dedicated college fund for Emily. It wouldn't just pay for her tuition, it would be her fund, a legacy from her mother and a testament to my post-military mission. The HOA seemed like a minor nuisance. The covenants were standard: keep your lawn mowed, don't paint your house purple, the usual stuff. I read them cover to cover before I bought. There was not a single word, not a phrase, not a whisper about short-term rentals. It was a non-issue. For the first 6 months, life was idyllic. I renovated the guest house, got my city permits, and listed it. My guests were wonderful: couples on weekend getaways, parents visiting their kids at the local university, professionals in town for conferences. They were quiet, respectful, and my reviews were stellar. I met my neighbors, who were all perfectly pleasant, and then I met Karen. Our first interaction was over my mailbox. Apparently, its shade of black was non-compliant. It was the exact same mailbox the previous owner had for 10 years, but because I was new, it was suddenly a problem. I repainted it. A week later, it was a notice about my garbage cans being visible from the street for 2 hours after the pickup time. I started setting a timer. It was clear she was testing me, probing for weakness, establishing her dominance. I saw her for what she was: a petty tyrant ruling a tiny, self-made fiefdom. Her power came from the apathy of the other homeowners, who found it easier to pay a small fine or repaint a mailbox than to fight her. She thrived on conflict, but only on her terms, ambushing people with rules they didn't know existed. The Airbnb was the perfect catalyst for her obsession. It was something new, something she didn't understand and couldn't immediately control. It represented an independence she couldn't tolerate. In her mind, my tidy, profitable, and perfectly legal enterprise was a direct challenge to her authority. And so she had launched her grand offensive, bringing in the city as her heavy artillery, never imagining for a second that she was marching her forces directly into a kill box I had designed myself. As Officer Thompson stammered apologies and beat a hasty retreat, leaving a fuming Karen alone on my driveway, I knew the real war had just begun. This wasn't about a city ordinance anymore. She would retreat, regroup, and attack on a different front: the HOA itself. And I would be ready. My mission was no longer just about Emily's college fund. It was about defending my property, my rights, and my peace against a bully who had picked the wrong veteran to mess with. The JAG colonel in me was wide awake. The day after the humiliating spectacle on my driveway, the first volley of Karen's new offensive landed in my mailbox. It wasn't a single letter. It was a fusillade. A crisp white envelope from the Oakmont Meadows HOA, fat with paperwork. Inside, I found not one, but 4 separate violation notices. The first was for unapproved landscaping modifications, citing 3 new rose bushes I had planted near the guest cottage. The fine was $50. The second was for improper exterior lighting. A string of tasteful solar-powered cafe lights I'd hung over the cottage patio for my guests was apparently a nuisance, and not in keeping with the community's aesthetic character. The fine was $100. The third was a true work of fiction: excessive noise complaint, dated from a night 2 weeks prior. 2. It claimed a neighbor had reported loud music coming from my property at 11:30 p.m. I knew for a fact that my guests on that date were a retired couple in their 70s who had come to town for a bird-watching convention. The fine was $250, but the fourth notice was the masterpiece. It was a violation for operating a commercial enterprise from a residential property. It cited a vague clause in the covenants about a home not being used for offensive trade or business. This, she clearly believed, was her new silver bullet. The fine was $500, with a stern warning that it would be levied weekly until the commercial activity ceased. The total was $900. It was absurd, a transparently vindictive cash grab designed to bleed me out. But it was also clever. Unlike the city ordinance, which was a matter of public law, HOA governance is a strange little bubble of private contract law. She was the judge, jury, and executioner. My only recourse was an appeal to the HOA board, a board she controlled with an iron fist. Any other person might have gotten angry, written a furious check, or fired off an emotional email. I did none of those things. I took a deep breath, laid the 4 notices out on my dining room table, and got to work. My training kicked in. Rule 1, document everything. I took high-resolution photos of the letters. I created a new folder on my computer labeled Karen HOA Offensive and created subfolders for each violation. I scanned the documents and saved them as PDFs with detailed file names. Next, I started building my counter-narrative. For the landscaping violation, I pulled up the HOA's own architectural guidelines from the document packet I'd received when I bought the house. I found the relevant section. It required approval for major structural or landscape changes. It defined major as anything involving hardscaping, tree removal, or changes to the property's grade. Planting 3 small rose bushes didn't even come close. I highlighted the section and saved it. For the lighting violation, I walked outside and took a dozen photos of the cafe lights from every conceivable angle, including from the street and my neighbor's property lines, showing they were subtle and cast a gentle downward glow, not a harsh glare. I then went for a walk around the neighborhood and photographed at least 10 other houses with similar or far more garish string lights, evidence of selective enforcement. For the noise complaint, I logged into my Airbnb account and pulled up the reservation details for the couple in question. I then drafted a polite email to them explaining that I was dealing with a spurious complaint from my HOA and asking if they would be willing to provide a brief statement about their stay, specifically regarding the noise level. They responded within an hour, horrified and apologetic, confirming they were in bed by 9:30 p.m. each night and that the only sound they heard was crickets. They were happy to sign a sworn affidavit to that effect. Gold. For the commercial enterprise violation, I went back to the covenants. The clause she cited was clearly intended to prevent someone from, say, running an auto repair shop out of their garage or a noisy manufacturing business. It was a standard nuisance clause, not a commercial ban. More importantly, I cross-referenced it with state law. Recent court rulings in our state had established a precedent. Unless an HOA's governing documents contained a specific unambiguous prohibition against short-term rentals, vague business use clauses were not enforceable against them. Karen's silver bullet was a blank, but I wasn't just going to defend. I was going on offense. I installed a new security system. Not just a doorbell camera, but 4 high-definition, night vision-capable cameras covering every inch of my property's perimeter. One was aimed squarely at my driveway and the public street in front of my house. Another covered the path leading to the guest cottage. A third watched over my back fence line. The fourth had a wide-angle view of my entire front yard, including the mailbox that had started it all. The system had motion detection and recorded crystal-clear audio. Any uninvited visit from Karen or her proxies would now be captured in 4K resolution. My house was no longer just a home. It was a fortified position, a data collection center for the war to come. I spent the rest of the day drafting my formal responses. Not angry tirades, but calm, precise, legalistic rebuttals. For each violation, I wrote a separate letter. I cited the specific HOA guideline or state law that exonerated me. I attached my photographic evidence. I included the statement from my guests. I was building a case, not just for the HOA's sham appeals committee, but for an actual court of law should it come to that. In each letter, I respectfully denied the violation, stated I would not be paying the fine, and formally requested the charge be expunged from my record. I concluded each one with the same sentence. Please be advised that any further attempts to levy fines based on these demonstrably false claims will be viewed as a pattern of targeted harassment and will be dealt with accordingly. I sent the letters via certified mail, return receipt requested. It was overkill, but it was necessary. It created an undeniable paper trail. Karen couldn't claim she never received them. The signed receipt would be Exhibit A. As I dropped the thick envelopes into the mailbox at the post office, I felt a grim satisfaction. She had fired her opening salvo, expecting me to crumble. Instead, I had built a fortress of evidence and returned fire with cold, hard facts. The ball was back in her court. I knew this wouldn't deter her, it would only enrage her. She had been humiliated once. Now she had been defied. Her next move would be more desperate, more personal, and likely more foolish. And my cameras would be waiting. The certified letters worked like a cattle prod on a bull. For about a week, there was an eerie silence. The mail brought no new violations. My trash cans were left unmolested. It was the calm before the storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it lunges. Then, the escalation began, and it was more invasive than I could have imagined. Karen moved from bureaucratic warfare to direct psychological warfare. She started stalking my property. My new security cameras, which I checked daily, began to tell the story. The first time, it was just after 10 p.m. A notification popped up on my phone. Motion detected driveway cam. I opened the live feed to see Karen's hulking SUV parked across the street. She was just sitting there, the faint glow of her phone screen illuminating her face as she stared at my house. She stayed for almost an hour, a silent, menacing presence in the dark. A few days later, it happened again. This time, a new set of guests had just arrived, a young family with 2 small children excited for a weekend trip to the nearby amusement park. As they were unloading their minivan, Karen's SUV crawled past my house, slowing to a near stop. My camera's microphone picked up the distinct sound of a phone camera's click, click, click. She was photographing them, photographing their children. A cold fury, different from the strategic calm I'd felt before, began to burn in my gut. This was no longer about me or my property. She was harassing innocent people, families who had done nothing more than rent a place to stay for a few days. The next morning, the father of the family knocked on my door. He looked stressed and deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Davis," he began, shifting his weight. "I don't want to cause any trouble, but a woman came to our door a few minutes ago." I knew exactly who it was. Let me guess, middle-aged, pink tracksuit, sense of entitlement the size of Texas? He managed a weak smile. That's the one. She said she was the neighborhood watch captain and that she needed to verify our identities for security purposes. She asked for my name, my wife's name, where we were from. She even asked how much we were paying you. It felt really weird, like an interrogation. I clenched my jaw. I am so sorry you had to deal with that. Her name is Karen Miller. She is the HOA president, and she has a personal vendetta against me because I operate this rental. You have no obligation to speak with her or provide her with any information. She has no authority to do what she did. The man looked relieved. Okay, good. It felt wrong. My wife was pretty freaked out. We just wanted a quiet weekend. We're not looking for trouble. You won't get any from me, I assured him. I will handle this. Please, try to enjoy your stay. After he left, I went straight to my computer. I saved the camera footage of Karen photographing his family. Then I wrote him an email summarizing our conversation and what he had told me about Karen's visit. I ended it just as I had with the bird-watching couple. If you would be willing to sign a statement detailing this interaction, it would be immensely helpful in stopping this harassment for future guests. He replied almost immediately, "Absolutely, that woman has no right to bother people like that." This was a critical turning point. Karen's obsession was now creating a stream of witnesses for me. Every guest she harassed was another nail in her coffin. But her campaign didn't stop there. She began to poison the well with my neighbors. One afternoon, while I was doing yard work, my next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Tom, came over to the fence. "Hey, Mark," he said, looking shifty. "Can I ask you something? Are you screening the people who stay in your guest house?" The question was loaded. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone even. "They're all registered through Airbnb, which has its own identity verification. I have a minimum age requirement and a strict no-party rule. Why do you ask?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Karen has been sending out emails to the whole neighborhood. She's saying that short-term rentals bring crime, that our property values are going to plummet. She attached a news article from another state about an Airbnb party that got out of hand. She's telling everyone your place is a magnet for transients and criminals. So that was her new angle. Fear-mongering, spreading disinformation. It was a classic tactic of a petty dictator. Create a boogeyman to consolidate power. And do you believe that, Tom? I asked quietly. He looked at my perfectly manicured lawn, the quiet, peaceful cottage. He looked at me, a man he'd had several pleasant conversations with over the past few months. No, of course not, he admitted. Your guests are quieter than the last family that lived in that house, but people are getting worked up. Karen is very persuasive. She's a bully, Tom, I said simply, and she's lying. She's not doing this to protect the neighborhood. She's doing it to punish me for proving her wrong. I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was one of the apathetic ones, the ones who just wanted to be left alone. But even he was starting to see the truth. The harassment was now a multi-front war, bureaucratic, direct, and informational. I continued my meticulous documentation. Every email from Karen to the neighborhood was saved. Every piece of footage of her car parked outside my house was cataloged. Every statement from a harassed guest was notarized. My evidence folder was growing into a formidable weapon. I knew a simple appeal to the HOA board would be useless. It was a kangaroo court. I needed to bypass them entirely. I needed to build a case so overwhelming that when the time was right, I could detonate it in a public forum, leaving her with no plausible deniability and no allies to hide behind. The stress was significant, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. It was infuriating to have my peace so thoroughly violated, but every time I felt the anger rising, I channeled it. I'd go to my desk, open the Karen HOA offensive folder, and add another piece of evidence. Each entry was a small act of rebellion, a quiet promise of the reckoning to come. She thought she was wearing me down, but she was actually forging me into the instrument of her own destruction. My conversation with Tom was an eye-opener. Karen's propaganda campaign was more effective than I'd realized. While Tom was skeptical, others might not be. Fear is a powerful motivator, and she was wielding it like a club. I knew I couldn't win by hiding behind my fortress of evidence. I had to engage on the human front. I needed to build my own coalition. My first stop was intentional. A few streets over lived a man named David Miller. No relation to Karen, thankfully. Miller was a retired Marine sergeant, a fact made plain by the immaculate EGA sticker on his truck and the perfectly folded flag he raised and lowered from a 25-foot flagpole in his front yard every single day. I knew from the neighborhood grapevine that he and Karen had clashed repeatedly. I found him in his garage, polishing a set of chrome wrenches that looked clean enough to eat off of. He was built like a cinder block, with a gray flat top and arms covered in faded tattoos. "Sarge," I said, using the informal honorific as a sign of respect. He looked up, his eyes sharp and appraising. He recognized me from around the neighborhood. "Colonel," he replied, his voice a low gravel. He'd clearly done his own recon. "What can I do for you?" I got straight to the point. "I'm having a Karen problem, a big one. I heard you might have some experience in that arena." A slow, grim smile spread across his face. He put down his wrench. "Experience? Son, I've got a PhD in Karenology. Last year she tried to fine me $500 because my flagpole was 2 feet taller than the recommended height in the architectural guidelines. Recommended, not required. Then she tried to tell me my flag was a political statement." His knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of his workbench. I informed her in no uncertain terms that the day I take down that flag is the day they put me in the ground. And if she had a problem with its height, she could take it up with the 1st Marine Division. She backed off, but she sends me a nastygram every other month about something new. My truck tires are too aggressive. The oil stain on my driveway is a biohazard. He shook his head. "She's a cancer on this neighborhood." "She's trying to shut down my guest rental," I explained. I gave him the short version, the city ordinance I wrote, her public humiliation, The flood of bogus fines, the stalking, the harassment of my guests. As I spoke, his expression hardened. When I mentioned her photographing the family with kids, he let out a low whistle. That's a new level of crazy, even for her. She's crossing lines that can get her in real trouble. That's what I'm counting on, I said. But I can't fight her alone. She's got the other board members in her pocket and she's spreading rumors. I'm building a case against her, but I need allies. I need other people who she's wronged to be willing to stand up when the time comes. Miller's grim smile returned. Colonel, you just deputized your first volunteer. Who else is on your list? My next visit was to an elderly woman named Eleanor Gable. Mrs. Gable was in her late 80s, a widow who had lived in Oakmont Meadows since the houses were first built. Her garden was her pride and joy, a riot of color and life that was famous throughout the neighborhood. It was also a frequent target of Karen's tyranny. I found her tending her prize-winning azaleas. Mrs. Gable, I started gently. I'm Mark Davis from down the street. Oh, I know who you are, dear, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. You're the gentleman with the lovely little cottage, and the source of all our future crime waves, if Karen is to be believed. She winked, and I felt a surge of relief. She wasn't buying it. I explained why I was there, and she listened patiently, snipping away dead leaves as I spoke. Oh, that woman, she sighed when I finished. For 40 years I've had this garden. It's won awards from the City Garden Club. But since Karen took over the HOA 3 years ago, it's been a constant battle. My bird bath is an unapproved structure. My garden gnomes are tacky. Last spring she sent me a formal warning because my wisteria had grown 2 inches over the top of my own fence. 2 inches! She pointed a trowel at me, her eyes flashing. She tried to fine my son for parking his pickup truck on the street in front of my house for 3 hours while he was helping me move a new refrigerator. Said it was a commercial vehicle. The woman is drunk on a thimbleful of power. Would you be willing to say that publicly? I asked. In a meeting or in a signed statement? She stopped her gardening and looked me square in the eye. Young man, at my age you lose a lot of things. Your stamina, your hearing, your filter. I have nothing left to lose by speaking the truth. You tell me when and where. My final visit for the day was to the young family whose approved backyard playset had become Karen's obsession for an entire summer. I found the husband, a tech guy named Ben, washing his car. He was initially wary, a classic case of the conflict-averse homeowner who just wanted to be left alone. But as I laid out the pattern of Karen's behavior, my story, Sergeant Miller's, Mrs. Gable's, I saw his posture change. She sent us violation notices every week for 3 months about our kid's playset, he said, his voice tight with remembered frustration. Claimed we didn't get the right approval, even though we had the signed form from the old board president. We had to hire a lawyer to write her a letter to get her to stop. It cost us $1,000. And she's still on the board, I said, still holding all the power, still doing the same thing to other people. Ben threw his sponge into the soapy bucket with a splash. What do you need? That evening, the 4 of us, me, Sergeant Miller, Mrs. Gable, and Ben, met in my living room. I called it the Oakmont Meadows Liberation Front, which earned a chuckle from Miller. I laid out my strategy. It wasn't enough to fight our individual battles. We had to unite and attack the source of the problem, Karen's illegitimate authority. She's going to call a special meeting, I predicted. She's going to try and amend the bylaws to explicitly ban short-term rentals. That's her only move left. That meeting will be our battlefield. I looked around the room at my small, determined coalition. A retired JAG officer, a retired Marine, a wise old gardener, and a young father pushed too far. We were a motley crew, but we were united by a common enemy. She thinks she's fighting me, I told them. She's about to find out she's fighting all of us. The alliance was forged. The next phase of my plan could now begin. With my coalition in place, it was time to move from defense to offense. A key tenet of any successful campaign is to know your enemy. And in the world of HOA warfare, that means knowing the books. As a homeowner in good standing, despite Karen's best efforts to label me otherwise, I had the legal right to inspect the association's records, all of them. The next morning I drafted another formal letter. This one wasn't a rebuttal to a fine. It was a demand. Citing the relevant state statutes governing common interest communities, I requested access to inspect and copy the following: the last 5 years of complete unredacted financial records, including all bank statements, invoices, and receipts, all contracts with all vendors, the complete minutes of all board meetings, both regular and executive session, and all official correspondence sent by the board. It was a mountain of paper, and I knew it. The request was deliberately broad, designed to be a massive headache for her. It was also my legal right. I sent it, as always, via certified mail. The predictable response came a week later. It was a letter from Karen, dripping with condescension. She acknowledged my request, but stated that fulfilling it would be unduly burdensome and would require significant administrative costs. Therefore, the board would require a prepayment of $1,500 to cover the projected costs of labor and copying before they would begin to compile the documents. It was a classic stonewalling tactic, a fee designed to be so prohibitive that I would simply give up. She had once again underestimated me. I immediately wrote back. In my letter, I cited the specific part of the state law that stipulated the HOA could only charge for the actual cost of copying, which was set by statute at 10 cents per page, and could not charge for labor. I respectfully informed her that her demand for a $1,500 prepayment was illegal. I stated that I would be arriving at the management company's office on a specific date and time with my own portable scanner to inspect the documents as was my right, and that I would pay the statutory 10 cents per page for any documents I chose to copy. I finished the letter by stating that if access were denied, I would immediately file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office and seek a court order compelling access, along with all associated legal fees. I had called her bluff. She had no legal ground to stand on, and she knew it. A week later, I received a terse, one-sentence email from the HOA's third-party management company confirming my appointment. Checkmate. I arrived at the sterile, soulless office of the management company on the appointed day. A beleaguered-looking office manager led me to a small, windowless conference room where a dozen large banker's boxes were stacked against the wall. "It's all in there," she said, her tone making it clear she was not happy about this, and have fun. For the next 8 hours, I sat in that stuffy room and went through hell. I scanned thousands of pages of documents, invoices for lawn care, receipts for pool chemicals, endless email chains about parking disputes. It was tedious, mind-numbing work. But I was a man on a mission. I wasn't just looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for a pattern. I was looking for the subtle threads of incompetence and corruption that always exist around a petty tyrant like Karen. For the first few hours, I found nothing but the expected level of mundane mismanagement. Then, in a box labeled Vendor Contracts and in 2022, I found it. It was a contract for landscape maintenance. The previous long-standing contract with a reputable local company, Greenleaf Landscaping, had been terminated. A new contract had been awarded to a company called Prestige Property Solutions, LLC. The monthly fee was 30% higher than Greenleaf's had been. That was a red flag. I scanned the Prestige contract. The address listed for the company was a residential P.O. box. There was no website, no corporate registration number. The signature on the contract on behalf of Prestige was illegible. But the name of the LLC itself, Prestige Property Solutions, tickled a memory. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search of the state's corporate registration database. No company named Prestige Property Solutions LLC existed. It was a phantom. Then I did a social media search. I typed Karen Miller's name into Facebook. Her profile was mostly private, but her profile picture showed her beaming next to a younger man with a distinctive wispy goatee. Her nephew, according to a public comment from a relative. I zoomed in on the nephew's tagged name, Kevin Miller. Then I cross-referenced Kevin Miller's public profile. In one of his pictures, he was standing next to a beat-up pickup truck. On the door of the truck, barely visible but there, was a magnetic sign. It read, Prestige Property Solutions. My heart started to beat a little faster. I went back to the financial records, pulling the bank statements and canceled checks for the past year. Every month, a check for $4,800 was written from the HOA's operating account to Prestige Property Solutions. I looked at the back of the canceled checks, which the bank had scanned. The endorsement signature was sloppy, but the name was clear: Kevin Miller. Karen had terminated a contract with a legitimate, long-standing vendor and awarded a new, more expensive contract to her nephew's non-existent, unregistered, and uninsured company. She was funneling HOA dues directly into her family's pockets. This wasn't just a violation of HOA bylaws about self-dealing and conflicts of interest. This was likely criminal fraud. I carefully scanned every invoice, every check, every page of the bogus contract. I saved them in a new, heavily encrypted folder on my laptop titled The Nuke. This was it. This was the weapon that would not only remove her from power, but could potentially land her in a courtroom facing charges far more serious than violating a city ordinance. I continued digging. I found meeting minutes where Karen had railroaded the other two board members, two timid elderly men who clearly just did whatever she said, into approving the new contract without a competitive bidding process, which was a direct violation of the HOA's own bylaws. She had described Prestige as a highly recommended new firm that could provide more personalized service. It was all there, a perfect, self-contained narrative of corruption and deceit. As I packed up my scanner, my mind was racing. My case was no longer just about her harassment of me, it was about her betrayal of the entire community. She hadn't just been a bully, she had been a thief, cloaking her graft in the mundane bureaucracy of HOA management. The special meeting she was so desperate to call was looking better and better. She thought she was setting a trap for me. She had no idea she was actually building her own scaffold. Just as I'd predicted, the official notice arrived a week after my document dive. It was printed on cheerful yellow paper and taped to every mailbox post in the neighborhood. Notice of special meeting of the Oakmont Meadows Homeowners Association. The purpose was stated in bold, self-important letters: to discuss and vote upon a proposed amendment to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions to prohibit all short-term rental activities. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out, to be held in the community clubhouse. Karen was making her final move. The propaganda machine went into hyperdrive. Daily emails flooded our inboxes. One day it was a link to a cherry-picked statistic about crime rates in tourist areas. The next, it was an anonymous, unverified testimonial from a supposed homeowner in another city, lamenting how an Airbnb next door had destroyed their peace and quiet. She was a maestro of misinformation, playing on people's worst fears. She framed the issue as a simple choice. A vote for the amendment was a vote for safety, stability, and preserving property values. A vote against it was a vote for chaos, crime, and turning Oakmont Meadows into a rundown motel district. My name was never mentioned, but I was the ghost haunting every sentence she wrote. I was the unnamed boogeyman whose commercial enterprise was threatening their way of life. My coalition, the Liberation Front, sprang into action. We couldn't match her volume, so we focused on precision and truth. Sergeant Miller, with his impeccable military bearing, went door to door. He didn't argue about the rental. Instead, he talked about Karen. He shared his story about the flagpole. He talked about her pattern of selective enforcement and bullying. He was calm, respectful, and undeniably credible. He wasn't asking for their vote. He was just asking them to consider who was really proposing this change and why. Mrs. Gable activated her own network, the Garden Club Mafia, as she called it. Decades of friendships and shared cups of tea gave her access and trust that Karen could only dream of. She talked to her friends about her wisteria, about the constant nitpicking, about how the joy was being sucked out of the neighborhood by one power-hungry woman. She planted seeds of doubt not with fear, but with quiet shared frustration. Ben, the tech-savvy father, created a simple one-page website. At the top it just said, The other side of the Oakmont HOA story. On it, we posted our own stories, factually and without emotion. Ben's story about the playset and the lawyer's fees, Miller's story about the flag, Mrs. Gable's story about her garden, and my story detailing the bogus fines and the harassment of my guests, complete with the notarized statements from the family she had confronted. We didn't email the link to everyone. Instead, we spread it through word of mouth, letting it circulate organically. It was our counter-narrative, a repository of truth against her flood of lies. While my allies fought the information war, I prepared for the legal battle. I took my folder labeled The Nuke to a lawyer friend of mine, a sharp litigator I'd known since my JAG days who now specialized in corporate law. He agreed to help me pro bono after he saw the evidence. "Mark, this is incredible," he said, looking up from the fraudulent Prestige Property Solutions contract. "This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is textbook embezzlement and fraud. She used her position as a fiduciary to enrich her family. The district attorney would have a field day with this." We spent an afternoon mapping out the strategy for the meeting. The key was not to get bogged down in a debate about the merits of short-term rentals. That was her battlefield, and she had framed the terms of the debate. We had to change the battlefield. "Don't defend, attack," my lawyer advised. "The moment you start justifying your rental, you've already lost. The entire conversation needs to be about her fitness to serve, her abuse of power, and her financial crimes. You need to seize control of the meeting's agenda." He also found a critical procedural flaw in her plan. According to the HOA's own bylaws, amending the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the highest governing document, required not just a majority of those present at a meeting, but a yes vote from 67% of the total homeowners in the association. There were 150 homes in Oakmont Meadows. Karen needed 101 yes votes to win. "There is no way she gets that," my lawyer said. "She might get a majority of the people who show up, the ones she's scared into a frenzy, but getting 101 total votes on a contentious issue like this, it's practically impossible unless you have near unanimous support, which she clearly doesn't." Karen was so blinded by her personal vendetta that she had overlooked the most fundamental rule of her own power structure. She was leading her followers into a battle she mathematically could not win. This discovery was the final piece of the puzzle. We had the emotional support from the neighbors. We had the irrefutable evidence of her financial crimes. And now we had the procedural kill shot that would invalidate her entire effort. The night before the meeting, I sat on my porch looking at the quiet guest cottage. The cafe lights, the source of one of her first bogus finds, cast a warm, gentle glow. A new family was staying there, a young couple celebrating their anniversary. They were inside, quiet, bothering no one. This whole fight had started over this little building, but it had become so much more. It was about the principle that a person's home is their castle, and no petty tyrant with a clipboard has the right to lay siege to it. It was about the idea that rules should be a shield for the community, not a sword for the powerful. Tomorrow, I wasn't just going to save my small business, I was going to liberate my neighborhood. The community clubhouse was buzzing with a nervous energy I hadn't felt since waiting for a verdict in a court-martial. The air was thick with cheap coffee, gossip, and anxiety. Karen had managed to draw a crowd. At least 100 homeowners had turned out. Far more than the usual dozen who attended regular board meetings. She had successfully manufactured a crisis, and now the townspeople were gathered with their pitchforks. My allies and I took seats near the front, a small solid island in a sea of uncertain faces. Sergeant Miller sat ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Gable gave me a reassuring pat on the arm. Ben was nervously tapping his phone, probably checking the traffic on our little website. My lawyer, Alex, was in the back, a neutral observer ready to step in if things went completely off the rails legally. Karen stood at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by the 2 other board members, a pair of elderly men named Stan and Bob who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen, however, was in her element. She radiated a smug, triumphant energy. Dressed in a severe navy blue blazer with a gaudy HOA president name badge pinned to the lapel, she looked at the crowd as a queen surveying her loyal subjects. She had the votes she needed from those in the room, and she believed that was all that mattered. She was about to preside over the public execution of my business, and she was savoring every moment. She banged a gavel with theatrical force. This special meeting of the Oakmont Meadows Homeowners Association will now come to order. She launched into a long, rambling preamble about the importance of community, the sanctity of their neighborhood, and the external threats that sought to undermine their peaceful way of life. It was a masterclass in fear-mongering filled with loaded terms like unvetted transients, revolving door of strangers, and protecting our children. She never mentioned me by name, but every eye in the room occasionally flickered toward me. I just sat there, my face a neutral mask, my hands resting calmly on the table in front of me. I let her talk. I let her dig her own grave a little deeper with every lie and exaggeration. Finally, she got to the main event. And so, she declared, her voice rising with manufactured passion, the board proposes Amendment 14C to our governing covenants. This amendment, for the protection and preservation of our community, will prohibit any homeowner from leasing or renting their property for any period less than 6 months. This is our chance to close the loophole that threatens our property values and our safety. She paused for effect, letting the applause from her core group of supporters wash over her. We will now open the floor for a brief discussion before we proceed to the vote. A few of her pre-selected cronies stood up to voice their support, echoing her talking points about noise and safety. Then she made her fatal mistake. With a magnanimous, condescending smile, she said, "Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment?" This was my moment. I stood up slowly. A hush fell over the room. "Karen," I began, my voice calm and carrying easily through the silent space, "I'm not here to talk about the amendment." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened. "Mr. Davis, this meeting is about the amendment. If you don't wish to speak on the topic, please sit down." "Oh, this is about the amendment," I replied, taking a step forward. "But more importantly, it's about the person who proposed it. It's about a pattern of abuse, harassment, and what I have recently discovered to be criminal activity conducted by you, in your capacity as HOA president." The room went dead silent. Karen's face went pale. "That is an outrageous and slanderous accusation," she sputtered. "I will not be libeled in a public meeting." "It's not libel if it's true," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "And I have proof." I held up a slim folder. "I'm sure many of you have received Karen's emails about the dangers I'm supposedly bringing to this community. What she fails to mention is that this all started when she tried to have me fined by the city for my rental, and was publicly humiliated when it was revealed that I was in full compliance with the law I helped write. This isn't about community safety. This is a personal vendetta." I turned to the audience. "Raise your hand if you have ever received a petty, unfair, or seemingly retaliatory fine from this HOA board." Slowly, tentatively, a few hands went up, then a few more. Sergeant Miller shot up like a rocket. Mrs. Gable raised hers gracefully. Ben raised his. Soon, nearly a third of the room had their hands in the air. It was a powerful visual indictment. Karen looked horrified. "Now," I continued, my voice like a hammer, "let's talk about something more serious than petty fines. Let's talk about your money, the dues you all pay to maintain this community." I opened my folder. I recently conducted a lawful inspection of the HOA's financial records. I found that last year, Karen unilaterally terminated the contract with Greenleaf Landscaping, a company we used for over a decade. She then awarded a new, much more expensive contract to a company called Prestige Property Solutions, without a competitive bid, a violation of our bylaws. I held up a copy of the contract. The problem is, Prestige Property Solutions isn't a real company. It's not registered with the state. It has no insurance. It's a phantom, and I know who owns it. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. It's operated by her nephew, Kevin Miller. For the last 18 months, Karen Miller has been funneling nearly $5,000 of your money every single month directly to her own family member through a fraudulent contract. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, their faces masks of shock and anger. The two other board members, Stan and Bob, looked at Karen with pure terror in their eyes. They were complicit. "I have copies of the checks," I announced over the din. "Endorsed by her nephew. I have the fake contract. I have the meeting minutes where she lied to the other board members about this phantom company." Karen was backed against the wall, her face a mess of sweat and fury. "Lies! It's all lies! This is a smear campaign!" she shrieked. But no one was listening to her anymore. They were listening to me. The tide had turned completely and irrevocably. The chaos in the clubhouse was a beautiful thing to behold. It was the sound of a dictatorship crumbling. The homeowners, once divided by Karen's fear-mongering, were now united in their outrage against her. They weren't talking about my Airbnb anymore. They were shouting about their money, about the deception, about the blatant corruption I had just exposed. Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel uselessly against the podium, her shrieks of "Order, order!" swallowed by the roar of the crowd. I let the anger swell for a moment, then I raised my hand for silence. Surprisingly, the room quieted, all eyes turning back to me. They were looking for leadership, for a way out of the mess. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice cutting through the remaining murmurs. I addressed Karen directly, but my words were for the entire audience. "Even if we were to ignore your harassment, your abuse of power, and your financial crimes, this entire meeting is a sham. Your proposed amendment was doomed from the start." I held up a copy of the HOA's own bylaws. Article X, Section 2. Amending the covenants requires a 67% affirmative vote of the total membership. Not the people in this room, Karen, total. That means you need 101 homes to vote yes. You were never going to get that. You brought all these people here on a lie for a vote that could never have passed, all to pursue your personal vendetta against me. The final nail was in the coffin. Not only was she a corrupt bully, she was an incompetent one. She didn't even understand the rules of her own game. Her authority, which she had wielded with such arrogance, was revealed to be a hollow shell. At that moment, Sergeant Miller stood up, his voice booming through the room with parade ground authority. "I believe there's a provision in our bylaws for the removal of a board member for gross misconduct and dereliction of duty. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Miller and her removal from the HOA board, effective immediately." Ben, my tech-savvy ally, jumped to his feet. "I second that motion." Karen's face, if possible, went even whiter. "You can't do that. That's not on the agenda," she stammered. My lawyer, Alex, who had been watching from the back, finally stepped forward. He wasn't acting as my lawyer now, he was acting as a concerned expert. "Actually, ma'am," he said calmly, addressing Karen but projecting to the room, "the bylaws do allow for a motion from the floor to remove a director for cause, provided a quorum is present. And looking around this room, you certainly have a quorum. The motion is valid." The two other board members, Stan and Bob, saw their escape route. They were staring at the angry faces in the crowd, at the stack of evidence in my hand, and they knew they were seconds away from going down with the ship. Stan was the first to break. I resign from the board," he squeaked, practically running from the podium. A second later, Bob followed. "Me too, I resign." In the span of 30 seconds, Karen's entire power base had evaporated. She was alone at the podium, exposed and abandoned. The vote of no confidence was almost a formality. It was a sea of hands, a near unanimous roar of "aye" when the question was called. When the call for nay came, only a single trembling hand went up, Karen's. It was the most pathetic, defeated gesture I had ever seen. She had been publicly and completely stripped of her power. A homeowner, a retired accountant, was nominated to serve as interim president to oversee a new board election. My allies and I didn't seek positions. Our goal wasn't to seize power, but to dismantle a corrupt regime. The interim president's first act was to formally declare the proposed amendment dead and to table a motion, which passed unanimously, to rescind every fine Karen had levied against me, Sergeant Miller, Mrs. Gable, and anyone else who had been a victim of her selective enforcement over the past year. My record was wiped clean. As the meeting broke up, people came over to shake my hand, to clap me on the back, to thank me. They weren't just thanking me for saving them from a bad bylaw, they were thanking me for giving them their neighborhood back. I saw Karen slipping out a side door, her face a thunderous mask of humiliation. She didn't look at anyone. Her reign was over. Later that night, I sat at my dining room table and logged into my computer. I opened the folder named Karen Ho Offensive and all its subfolders filled with videos, letters, and statements. I dragged the entire folder into the trash bin. Then I opened the encrypted folder labeled The Nuke. I copied its contents onto a secure flash drive. The next morning, I would be dropping it off at the district attorney's office. My fight with Karen was over, but her reckoning with the law was just beginning. The sense of relief was immense, like a physical weight being lifted off my shoulders. It was the feeling of a mission accomplished, of justice served not through brute force, but through patience, strategy, and the simple, unassailable power of the truth. In the weeks following the disastrous HOA meeting, a palpable sense of peace settled over Oakmont Meadows. It was like the air after a thunderstorm, clean, fresh, and quiet. The interim board, led by the no-nonsense retired accountant, moved quickly. They hired a forensic auditor to go through the years of financial records I had flagged, and they immediately terminated the fraudulent contract with Prestige Property Solutions. They rehired the old, reliable Greenleaf Landscaping Company at the original lower price. They sent out a community-wide letter apologizing for the past administrative abuses and outlining a new commitment to transparent, fair, and consistent governance. They were healing the wounds Karen had inflicted. The district attorney's office was very interested in the flash drive I provided. An investigator called me a week after I dropped it off. He confirmed they were opening a formal criminal investigation into Karen Miller for embezzlement and fraud. Her nephew, Kevin, had apparently confessed to the entire scheme the moment 2 detectives showed up at his door. He was trying to cut a deal, leaving Karen to face the full force of the consequences alone. Her web of lies had completely unraveled. Then, about a month after the meeting, I saw it. A for sale sign being hammered into Karen's front lawn. It was the ultimate unspoken admission of defeat. She could no longer bear to live in the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist, surrounded by the people who had witnessed her public downfall. She had become a pariah in her own kingdom. The day the moving truck came was a bright, sunny Saturday. I was in my front yard planting some new flowers, this time without fear of a bogus violation notice. The huge truck was parked in front of her house and movers were carrying out boxes and furniture. I saw her for the last time, directing the movers, her face drawn and tired. The lurid pink tracksuit was gone, replaced by a drab, shapeless gray sweatsuit. She had lost her power, her reputation, and now she was losing her home. As she turned to get into her car, her eyes met mine across the street. There was no fire in them anymore, no arrogant fury. There was just a hollow, exhausted bitterness. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness or sympathy, it was a nod of finality, a quiet acknowledgement that the conflict was over, and justice had been done. She quickly looked away and got into her car, driving away from Oakmont Meadows for good. Watching her car disappear down the street, I felt not a surge of triumph, but a deep and profound sense of peace. The battle had been long and stressful, a drain on my time and energy, but it had been necessary. It was never just about the money from the guest cottage. It was about standing up to a bully. It was about refusing to let entitlement and abuse of power go unchallenged. It was a lesson I had learned in the military and applied to my civilian life. You don't cede ground to tyrants no matter how petty their kingdom. My little coalition remained friends. Sergeant Miller and I started a weekly breakfast club for veterans in the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable's garden flourished, more vibrant than ever, and she even gave me some of her award-winning azaleas for the path to the guest cottage. Ben's kids played on their playset without fear, and he was elected to the new reformed HOA board, where he championed a new bylaw mandating that all vendor contracts go through a transparent competitive bidding process. My guest cottage, the catalyst for the entire conflict, was thriving. It was booked solid for months. The income was steadily growing Emily's college fund, which was now larger than I had ever hoped. The cottage was no longer just a source of income. It was a symbol of the right to use your property peacefully, a symbol of the victory of reason over paranoia, and a symbol of a community that had found its way back from the brink. I had come to Oakmont Meadows seeking a quiet life, a new mission after a lifetime of service. I hadn't expected that mission to be a war in my own neighborhood. But in the end, by applying the same principles of discipline, strategy, and integrity that had guided my entire career, I had not only won the war, but had also helped build a better, more just community in its wake. And that was a victory far more satisfying than any fine I could have collected or any argument I could have won. It was the victory of order over chaos, of justice over tyranny. And my quiet life was finally truly quiet.